Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the Cemetery Walk. My name is John Lawrence Townley, and this is my lovely wife, Sarah Jones Townley, and we're going to give you a little story on how we came to settle here in Longmont. I was born in Lancashire, England in 1822. My family soon moved to Stockport, England, and that's where I met my lovely wife, Sarah. We were married in 1843, and at that time I had been working in the cotton mills as a spinner. Life was very difficult there. The factories were very smoky, very dusty, so I was always looking for something better to do. So in 1953, we immigrated to America, and at that point in time,
Well, I had to pack everything that I had into this one oaken chest. And I had to put all the necessities we needed as well as clothing into that chest, but I did manage to get a few treasures in there. I'm not sure John knew that, but I put some blue willow china in, and I also had a teapot that was my absolute favorite. It had a little knob at the top. When you push the knob, the tea would come out of the spout. And I also managed to put in two beautifully woven shawls that had been my grandmother's. So I did come with those things. The chest was so heavy by the time I got everything in it. I just couldn't believe it when I saw this seaman hoist it up on his shoulders and carry it off of the ship all by himself.
We came to America and we settled in Fall River, Massachusetts. Once again, it was a cotton manufacturing city. So my oldest son Edward and I worked in the factory. We worked terrible hours, very early in the morning to very late at night. As a matter of fact, one of the mornings or one of the afternoons that Edward came home, he got there early, and one of his brothers came up to him and asked him what his name was because he was going to introduce him as a visitor to his mother.
Fall River brought us some sadness as well. We had a son named John because we wanted to carry on John Lawrence's name, and he passed away as a small child. A daughter of ours also passed away, and then we had a son whom we named John, again, to carry on the family name, and he passed away just shortly after he was born. We then went on to have another son. We named him John, and we ended up calling him Johnny. He did grow to be an adult. We had two more daughters and another son named Jones. All in all, we had 7 children who grew to be adults.
Well, once again, I'm thinking we need to find a better life for my family. The factory was getting way too difficult to work. And I'd heard about an emissary coming to Fall River from the Chicago, Colorado colony. His name was Robert Collier. It sounded interesting. They were founding a little town out in Colorado in the west. So I decided that sounded interesting, so I attended the meeting.
John came home so enthusiastic about what he had heard. I really had my doubts, but the more he talked, the more I was convinced that we could find a better life for ourselves by heading west.
Well, Longmont was a planned community at that point in time. They'd already laid it out. It was a mile square, it had a central business district, and it had a private, a lot of private areas with wide avenues. And they named the streets already for some of the founders, such as Gay and Collier and Bowen. Well,
they were very, very
well, they had everything. Yeah,
beliefs.
Well, they had the beliefs, but they also had rooms for churches, and they had 5 spots for churches. They had 2 spots for schools. They had university. They had a full lot for a university. So they were ready to go.
These men impressed us so much with their strong congregational background. We really identified with them. These men were very hardworking, sober men, and they had a motto for our new Chicago colony. Their motto was industry, morality, and temperance. In fact, written into each deed was the fact that if you were to serve alcohol on the premises, any liquor, that your property could revert back to the Chicago colony.
Yeah. Well, the meeting was very, very tremendous, and I decided to sign up. And I actually bought certificate number 3, which entitled me to a private lot a business lot, and an acreage outside the city. Now that was a $5 sign-up fee, and there was another $150 subscription fee that entitled us to this, and 40 acres of land actually outside of Longmont.
Our daughter, Grace, had married Thomas Howard the year before we decided to head west. So they decided to join us in our venture to the Chicago colony. And the John Buckley family also came with us. Well, we had heard stories about wild animals and Indians running all over the place, so John Lawrence managed to purchase a musket. And the boys carried that musket all the way out to Colorado. Thank heavens we didn't have to use it, because I'm not sure we would have known how to use it.
Well, we did leave on train, by train. And we did come through eastern Colorado, and the children were quite enthralled with the animals they did see. They saw buffaloes and they saw antelopes and things. And so we got to Denver, and we switched trains, and we got on the Boulder Railway, which at that time took us as far north as Erie. There we got off, and that was in April of 1871. John Buckley and I got off, and we walked to Longmont, trudging through snow and mud. Later on, the women and the families all came afterwards on a wagon.
And we had to stay in a place called the Colony House. It was between 2nd and 3rd Avenue on the west side of Main Street. It had a stairway on the outside. The roof wasn't finished. Remember, we said it was April and it was cold and snowy. There was one bed for 24 people. We had to sleep on straw and cover ourselves with our clothing because our household items hadn't arrived yet. It was a miserable 2 weeks. It cost us $5 a week. And I tell you, at the end of 2 weeks, when we secured other accommodations, I was certainly glad we were out of there. By then, there were several hundred people living in Longmont, and they had started opening businesses, and they had started building homes.
Well, we were a little more organized now, and at that time, Tom Howard, our son-in-law, began building our house at 239 Pratt Street.
It was a beautiful New England cottage. It had 2 bedrooms, a parlor, and an upstairs half-story. The boys had to get water for us from the river, so they would fill the buckets and put it on a sledge and drag that sledge up to the house for us.
Yeah.
They worked hard.
The organizing committee at that time had decided that we better elect the officers for the town. So we did. We elected Seth Terry as president and myself as treasurer. At that time, I also used my option to buy the land north of Longmont to the original Townley farm, which was 3 miles north. I also bought property for my sons so they would have a place. We didn't have a house. There's no house on the property. We didn't know what to do, but we did look, and we found a house in Burlington, which is south of Longmont at that time. And we had it moved at that time up on the property. Well, being city folk, we really didn't know much about farming. The boys and I would walk out, and they would do the plowing, and I would dig the post holes. Were very, very long days, but you know, as I said, being city folk, I didn't know a horse from a mule. And I'll tell you one thing, though. Those horses, when you put the harnesses on them to work them, they were cantankerous. And I just decided at that point in time, I'm leaving the harnesses on. I'm not going to worry about it.
I was so glad when the house was made habitable on the farm, and we sold our house on Pratt to Captain George and Clara Brown, and we moved to the farm. The boys then had to walk into town to go to school, and they went to school in what was called Library Hall. That was a building donated by Elizabeth Thompson. Later on then, our older son Edwin donated a corner of his property at the corner of Vermilion and Hover Road to build the Armstrong School, and then they could go to school there. They had dances on the weekends at the Armstrong School, and Johnny and Jones would play the fiddle and play the piano and to entertain at the dances. And then afterwards, Jones would make this fabulous oyster stew. He served it up in these beautiful, heavy, white ironstone bowls. And Jones became very, very popular around this community as being a gourmet chef of that wonderful oyster stew. You remember that stew?
Yes.
So good.
Well, we did quite well on the farm. And as the years went by, the kids grew up. They got independent. And Sarah and I decided that we missed city life a little too much. So we moved to Denver in 1895.
We built a beautiful red brick home on Downing Street, and the boys loaded up all our possessions in a wagon, and they set off to go 40 miles to bring our things to us. It took them 12 hours to get there, and they were so tired by the time they got there, they decided they needed to do a little sightseeing and rest a little bit. So they spent 3 days going to places like the Tabor Opera House and the Curtis Street Theater.
Well, that was pretty much it. We bought some land outside of Denver at that time, which was very far east. We didn't know really what we were doing with it, but at that time, Sarah and I retired. So now we just spend our time going back and forth, visiting our children and our grandchildren. And that's the story of how the Townleys came to Longmont. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Seth Terry at your service. I was a public servant for a good number of my 81 years here on this earth. Born Enfield, Connecticut, 1820. Grew up around Enfield and went on to school to Wesleyan Academy in Massachusetts. Upon graduation, went back to Enfield and taught school for a number of years. Well, I always had a hankering to be a minister, so I went and enrolled in the seminary in Almenia, New York. Well, my health began to fail, and I decided to go back to Enfield and take up farming. And being as I was in the sunshine and nice clean air, my health began to improve. While farming in Enfield, I served as the town clerk, treasurer, registrar, and probate judge. Later on, I was elected to the Connecticut State Legislature, and I purchased a coal and lumber business in Hartford, Connecticut. Well, by 1855, I felt that I'd acquired all the skills needed to be a good community leader, and I had been married for 10 years to Clara Jane Burbank. Well, she was the prettiest girl in Enfield, at least I thought so. And why she put up with me for over 50 years, I'll never know. Well, the gypsy spirit started to take me over, and I decided to move the family out to Rockford, Illinois. By that time, we had 10 children and one on the way. We'd been pretty busy those first few years of marriage. Well, there in Rockford, my lumber business was pretty successful, and I received a telegram from Lieutenant Governor Boss in January 3rd, 1871, about the forming of the Chicago, Colorado colony. Well, seemed like a pretty good opportunity, so I went up to the meeting, and my gypsy spirit sort of took me over again, and I decided to join up. Well, on January 13th, I left Chicago with Mr. Byers, Emery, Kelly, and Hall in one of the worst snowstorms ever recorded in the history of Chicago. In January 19th, we arrived in Denver under the prettiest Colorado blue sky, sunshine, and not a bit of snow. We were met by General Cameron and Mr. Holmes of the Union Colony in Greeley. They wanted us to join up with them. Well, we thought it over and went up and even viewed their colony and found it to be very progressive, but we wanted to do things our own way. So we came back, scouted out some land, and decided to purchase 70,000 acres between Boulder and St. Vrain Creeks. We named the town after Long's Peak, and in May of 1871, I was elected the first president of the Chicago, Colorado colony. By June, we had over 400 people, and we were growing like a weed. Well, today, Longmont is the second largest city in Boulder County. While I served as president, I helped set up the first Sunday school, served as its first superintendent, was a charter member of the Methodist Church and Knights Templar, was a board member of the Longmont Creamery and Longmont Foundry. Mr. Kaufman, he decided to name Terry Street after me. And you know what? I decided to name Kaufman Street after him. Well, sometimes later, we were digging a water well, and we used this windlass to get the dirt out of the hole. and it came up and it struck me in the forehead and made a cut clean to the bone. Well, I was too ornery for it to kill me, but I was incapacitated for quite some time. Mr. Barnes, he took over control of the company funds, and because of some mismanagement, it led me to resign as the president of the Chicago, Colorado colony. In 1898, my wife, she passed on, and I was fairly lonely, and I decided that I would marry her sister Frances. We lived together for 2 years until I passed on in 1901. Frances, she lived to 1925, and at the time was 100 years old and the oldest woman in Boulder County. Well, my final resting place is over there. Kind of looks like the Washington Monument to me. I'm kind of proud of it. And my etching is on the other side facing east. Now I know that you folks are going to be heading on down the trail and seeing some other nice folks from around Longmont that helped make Longmont what it is today. I want to thank you for your time.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Mount View Cemetery. I'm glad that you showed up to visit with us for a few moments this afternoon because we do get kind of lonesome out here from time to time. Let me introduce myself. My name is John Owen. I was born in 1822 in Kane, Illinois. I was a farmer back there, and then later on in life I married this wonderful young lady next to me here, Mary.
Welcome to everybody. We're so glad you could come and join us this afternoon. My name is Mary Ann Boyd Owen, and I was born in 1833, and I'm 11 years younger than John. Sometimes you just have to add those little notes into it.
In 1873, we came west. We had 6 children at the time, and they were all boys, which is nice to have all boys when you're a farmer. And they were all very young at the time, and that's been so long ago. To see if we can remember their names, like James.
It's always a challenge.
James and
Frank
Edward,
and
Frank and
Elmer
and George.
And don't forget Fred.
Oh yeah, Fred.
Or maybe
yeah,
Fred.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, it took about all the money we had to come west to bring the 8 of us out here. We came on the train, which back in those days the train was fairly new then, and it was a little bit more comfortable than the old wagon and oxen or what have you. So we came out here, and we came as far as Erie, Colorado back in those days. That's as far as the train went. And I had a friend that lived in Longmont at the time. He was used to be our pastor back in Illinois, and he came out a few years before we did. And he would send us letters of the
Encouragement of how wonderful this
yeah, the
area
land was reasonable,
Yes.
and the employment was good, and
It just sounded too good to be true. And you know what they say, when it's too good to be true, you wonder if it is.
And at this time, he was the pastor of the Methodist Church in Burlington, the Reverend C.E. Klein, and he was to meet us there in Erie. But when we got off the train, we couldn't find him, and he was kind of going to show us around and show us the ropes and give us.
We were so looking forward to seeing him because we didn't know anybody in this area, and we were in hopes that he could help us get started and get situated.
But he was nowhere to be found, so we had to rent a horse and wagon to get to Longmont.
Yes.
And when we got to Burlington, actually, we found out that our friend, the Reverend C.E. Klein, had left Longmont and moved to Oregon. So we did find out that people in Burlington were very friendly and very helpful, and the kids, the boys were all tired and hungry and dirty.
It was a long trip.
And we finally did find lodging in Burlington there that first night.
But we were so disappointed because we had such big hopes that we were going to find our friend and get some assistance.
Well, back in 1873, the town of Longmont didn't really amount to too much. Fact is, it was only a couple years old, and it was a 1 square mile in size. And where you're standing today was way out of town. Fact is, people couldn't believe why they would put a cemetery so far out of town.
But now we look at it and we realize that was a good thinking at that time.
Now, do you remember, Mary, when the first train came to Longmont?
Oh.
You know, we was only here just a few months, and
Yes.
that was quite a celebration.
Quite a
wasn't it?
celebration to have the railroad spur come from Erie directly into Longmont. We were so impressed.
That was in April of 1873. We had our brand new depot built at First Avenue and Kimbark Street, and the whole town turned out to celebrate that day the train
It was
came
a
in.
big celebration.
That's a day we'll never forget. The boys had a great time that day for sure.
It was a day that the whole town celebrated, and we were so excited about it.
Well, things were kind of tough that first year or so, and to feed my family, I went buffalo hunting that first winter, and I was a farmer. I didn't know that much about buffalo hunting, but I figured you need to just get the biggest old buffalo you can find, and that way you feeding 8 of us, we'd have a lot of meat for the winter. So I shot a big old bull, and you know, that meat was so tough. He was a big old bull.
He was a big old tough bull.
Yeah, no matter how you fix that meat, it just was tough. But it kept the boys and us from starving that first winter. So
It also taught us a lesson.
the next winter, I went up here by Pawnee Buttes, and I went buffalo hunting up there. And so this time I just picked me out a little old fat cow, and boy, that was some good eating, wasn't it?
It was worth that lesson. That meat was delicious.
She was some good eating. Well, since I'd used my homestead rights already back in Illinois, we were kind of hanging around to get some reasonable farmland, and so in 1876 we did get a farm about 4 miles northeast of here. We bought it from the railroad company, and we were expecting our 7th child at that time, and we were finally realizing that the American dream is finally coming true. All the sacrifice and hardship that we made to come west, leaving our family and friends, and now we're here 3 years and things are just coming together, weren't they?
Oh, it was. We thought it was our dream come true.
Well, as life goes, we were in for another big surprise. It was on May 1st of 1876, I suffered a stroke and died 30 days short of my 54th birthday. Well, in life, I never was first at anything, but in death, I was the first person to be buried in Longmont's brand new Mountain View Cemetery over 130 years ago.
Right. And as time goes on, I'll try and finish the rest of the story. Of course, that was hardship for all of us. 4 months after John passed away, I delivered our 7th son, Logan. So I had 7 sons, a mortgage on the farm, didn't know anybody, only the people we had met since we had been here. Things were really a challenge for us. But the boys pitched in and did everything they could. They helped by hiring out and working for some of the farmers around here. In fact, they even were able to get some of the unwanted colts, and we were able to sell some of them for as much as $500 each. With that money, we were able to pay off the mortgage, so the farm was now ours. Of course, it was still a lot of work for us to do. But lo and behold, after John died, a peddler drove into our driveway. And it was so exciting because I had never done much shopping on my own. John had always taken the boys and gone in town because I didn't ride a horse, and the wagon we had was so rough to ride that I usually just let them do the shopping. But to see a peddler come in with a wagon full of wares, I was so excited I couldn't believe it. Didn't have any money, and I knew that, but that didn't stop me from looking and seeing what he had, and I could not believe it. Well, of course, the peddler told me, "Your credit's good, ma'am." That was probably not the best thing for him to say, because when he drove off, I had signed a note for $75. Of course, the boys were really upset with me for wasting the money. I'm sure there's some of the things there that I really didn't need, but I learned a lesson also that money is short and I had to take better care of it. Well, George was only 16 at that time, and he hired out for $10 a month until that bill was paid. It taught me a lesson. Those boys were really helping and pitching in like they should be. Well, James, he settled in Fort Lepton, and the older boys, they went off with some of the local cattlemen and with their cattle herds, and between Wyoming and Colorado, and they've settled out all in those areas. George stayed around, and he bought a farm about 7 miles northeast of here and turned that into a prosperous farm. It has the orchards and the big shade trees, and in fact it's still in the Owen family at this time. Well, as the boys got settled and I had to move into Longmont, I did have to sell the farm, and I moved into a little place into Longmont, and I lived there and enjoyed a good life in Longmont until July 27th, 1906. I was 73 years old when I passed out on and joined John. We had good memories of Longmont, and we're so happy you could come and share those with us here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mary Lord Pease Carr, and I've been asked by the Historical Society to tell you a little bit about my family and the early days of Longmont. So gather round, and I'll start at the beginning. I was born and raised in Maine and learned to be a school teacher. Later, I soon moved to Waukegan, Illinois, where I met and married my husband, Brian Carr. Brian was raised on a farm in New Hampshire, and when he was only 18 years old, the war between the states had started, so he quickly enlisted in the Army and served in the cavalry. During the war, he was captured by the Confederates and spent 4 months in a prisoner of war camp. He then was a part of a prisoner exchange, and it was right back to the fight. But only one day before Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Brian was severely wounded in the right arm, and it had to be amputated. After spending several months in an Army hospital, he went back home to finish his education. Then he too moved to Waukegan, Illinois, where he became a high school teacher. Just 1 year later, he was appointed as the county superintendent of schools, and shortly after that, we met, fell in love, and were married. Well, while he was still the superintendent of schools, Brian decided to study law, and he was quickly admitted to the Illinois bar. In 1871, Brian and his partner, Charles Day, decided to investigate professional opportunities out west, so they headed for the Colorado Territory. They went to Greeley first. That was a new town that had been founded by the newspaper mogul Horace Greeley, but it wasn't quite what they wanted. They had heard about a new town being founded by the Colorado-Chicago colony, so they decided to investigate it. They walked 50 miles across the prairie from Greeley to Longmont, and when they arrived, they decided this is where they were going to stay. I don't know if it was because of the long walk that they decided to stay, but they stayed. They went into business and they hung their shingle out that read, "Attorneys at Law in Real Estate." But business wasn't very good because Longmont was just too new, and Brian needed to figure out a way of making more money so he could send for me so I could join him. So he fell back on his old profession of school teaching. He opened the first school in Longmont. That first semester, there were 40 students, and the semester ran from June 15th to August 15th, so schooling wouldn't interfere with the planting and harvesting of crops. By midsummer, Brian had saved enough money that I could come join him, so I quickly packed our bags, and with my 2-year-old daughter, Susie, I headed for the Colorado Territory too. Well, by the time I came to Longmont, the town had started to grow, and Brian needed assistance with teaching, so I started teaching the younger children while he continued to teach high school and practice law. Well, we had big plans for that little one-room school, but we didn't have much equipment. So we decided we were going to order some. We ordered new desks and equipment that were sitting in a warehouse in Chicago, waiting to be delivered to us when the Great Chicago Fire happened and burned the warehouse to the ground with our equipment in it. It was devastating, but we had to continue on. We had no choice. Well, as the town grew, other teachers began to move into Longmont, and we eventually turned over the day-to-day education of Longmont's children over to them. This allowed us to pursue our political and social interests, mainly education, temperance, and women's suffrage. I still to this day cannot figure out why they would not allow women to vote, or why a man had to take a drink for that matter. And I wasn't alone in this thinking. After all, the founding fathers of the Chicago, Colorado colony had written in the town charter that Longmont was to be a temperance town. Well, Brian went on to become more involved in politics, and he was appointed as the district attorney for Boulder, Jefferson, and Clear Creek counties. I became more involved in community activities. I joined the Eastern Star and attended as their grand matron. I also was a founding member of the Longmont Women's Christian Temperance Union, the first in Colorado. Then Brian was elected as one of the 39 delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Denver. He was there to help write the Constitution of what we all hoped would become the new state of Colorado. During the convention, he tried to convince the other delegates to include the women's right to vote in the Constitution, but they wouldn't have anything to do with it because it was too hot a topic. They were afraid it would delay the appointment of the Constitution and harm our chances at statehood. But they did write in that women could have the right to vote in school board elections as long as the men of the district would allow it. Well, Brian and I were there in Denver together that day when the Colorado Constitution was appointed and President Grant was there to proclaim Colorado as the 38th state to be admitted to the Union. We were so proud that we had been a part of such a historic movement. Then I became the state and national president of the Women's Relief Corps. That's the auxiliary to the Grand Old Army of the Republic. I think that's still in existence today, and it's now called the Auxiliary of the Sons of Union Veterans. Brian was then elected as Attorney General for the state of Colorado, and he served 2 terms. As the suffrage movement was resurrected in earnest in the 1890s, I became a local and statewide leader in the movement to grant the women of Colorado the right to vote. That was 27 years before the rest of the country gave the women the right to vote. It was still 17 years too late as far as I was concerned, because it should have been included in the Colorado State Constitution, but it didn't. Later, the Democratic Party elected me for a seat in the legislature. I didn't win, but I did go on for years afterward to serve as a delegate for the Democratic Party conventions. Then, naturally, my Susie, being raised with political parents, became involved in her community. She too joined the Eastern Star with her friend Alice Callahan, and they were in the drill team together. She joined the Women's Relief Corps, and she became a teacher. After she was married, she was then Mrs. Susie Carr McGuire. She was the organizing regent of the Longs Peak Chapter, National Society Daughters of the Revolution, the one and only DAR chapter in Longmont. Well, it's been over 90 years now, and I hear that the chapter is still going strong, with over 50 members still serving the community. And my Susie will be glad to hear that their members are still meeting in her dear friend Alice Callahan's house yet today. As you can tell, I'm proud of my family and what we did in our involvement to help form this beautiful town of Longmont. So the next time you drive down Car Drive or you take your children to Car Park, I hope you'll remember us and tell them the history of our beautiful town, the town we built for them. Well, I know my other neighbors would like to meet you, so I'll say goodbye, and I hope you enjoyed my story.
Well, thank you for joining us today. I'm Charles Hover. This is my lovely wife, Catherine.
Hello. We're so happy you could come. We've come back especially today to tell you a little something about our lives when we lived here in Longmont.
Now, I was born in 1867 in Wisconsin. Attended the University of Wisconsin, where I studied to become a pharmacologist. When I was 21 years old in 1888, I left Wisconsin to join my brother William in the Hover Wholesale Drug Company in Denver, Colorado. I boarded a train and headed west. Well, when we got to the eastern part of Colorado, a little bit later, I noticed that everybody on the train was looking out into the window. Everybody was gawking outside, couldn't figure out what they were doing. Well, I took a look out the window and I got my first glimpse of the beautiful Rocky Mountains. What a magnificent sight! We didn't have that in Wisconsin. Well, all the way from where we first seen it until we got to Union Station in Denver, I don't think there was one person on that train that took their face away from the window. They were looking all the distance. Well, when we got to Union Station, I got off the train, walked 3 or 4 blocks to the Hover Wholesale Drug Company building where my brother was working, and that's where I was going to work. And that's when I met my future wife, Catherine.
Now, I was born Catherine Stewart Avey in 1873 in Polo, Illinois. When I was 4 years old, I moved with my family to Denver, where my father became a well-known jeweler. Well, when I grew up, I learned to play the piano and I loved to sing. And when I was a young woman, I went to work for my sister Minnie in the drugstore that she inherited from her husband when he died. Now, I used to walk down the street to Hover's Wholesale Drug Company to pick up supplies for Minnie. And that's when I met Charles.
And that's when I met Catherine. When I first laid eyes on that beautiful lady, I was smitten. And I wooed her relentlessly until she admitted that she liked it and she was going to marry me.
I must admit I was quite taken with Charles as well. And we were married in 1898 in Castle Rock, Colorado, which was a lovely resort area at the time.
Now, the Hover Wholesale Drug Company was doing quite well in Denver. In fact, Denver is doing quite well. Growing into a fairly large city. Hustle and bustle. Busy, busy, busy. Too much excitement for me. I wanted something a little less leisure life. Well, we had an event happen shortly thereafter that helped me make up my mind and make up my future life. You see, the Hover Wholesale Drug Company building was a 4-story wooden structure made out of native wood, pine to be exact. Not such a good wood for such a large building because as it aged, it got brittle, and consequently the supplies that we had stored on the upper floor of the building cracked the floor joists and the whole building came tumbling down. There was all of our supplies and all the rubble in the middle of the street. It's estimated we lost $50,000 in that accident. Now, many people say we overloaded the upper floors, too much supplies up there, but my brother William didn't think so. Consequently, he had an architect look at it and he said, we can rebuild the building, but it'll take 2 years to do that. Well, that gave me the opportunity I was looking for. I wanted to become a farmer, and I took the opportunity to look for a piece of land that I could buy. Looked all over the place. Found 160 acres out west of Longmont here, 3 or 4 miles outside of town. I paid $27,000 for it. Catherine and I moved from Denver to Longmont, and we became farmers.
Well, I must admit, the country life appealed to me as well, and I was happy to move here so Charles could fulfill his dream of becoming a farmer. but the property sat quite a ways from town on a dusty country road. It did, however, have an old farmhouse on it, at least, that we could live in.
Yeah, we farmed for about 10 years, lived in that farmhouse. Eventually, the activity of the farm was just too much for me, so I hired a foreman to help me out. Now, in that 10-year period, I used my knowledge of chemistry that I'd gotten at the pharmacology courses to help us grow bigger and better crops. And whenever we found something that worked, I'd pass it on to my neighbors so they could take advantage of it. Well, we decided that we wanted to build a large house on the property. But before we could do that, we built a small cottage that we would live in. The foreman would live in the old homestead.
And we lived in the cottage. Well, although the cottage was quite cozy, it only had one fireplace for heat, no running water, and no electricity. Well, after just one winter there, I said, that's enough of that. We are moving to town, which is what we did during the winter months. Then during the summer, we went back out to the cottage. Well, now, it was during this time that we heard about a little orphan girl without any place to live. Having no children of our own, our hearts went out to her, and we invited her into our home. Well, we fell in love with little Beatrice, and we adopted her. And oh, what a joy she was in our lives, wasn't she, Charles?
What?
A joy. Beatrice was a joy in our lives,
Oh,
wasn't
absolutely. She was wonderful.
she? He's a little hard of hearing, you know.
Well, we would start construction on the new house in the latter part of 1912. It's called a Tudor Revival style. The interior is decorated in what they call the arts and craft of the era. Hardwood floors throughout, high beam ceilings, many, many cabinets, and many, many, many bookshelves.
Oh, yes. I wanted plenty of bookshelves to house our treasured volumes. Reading was a favorite pastime of ours, and I wanted plenty of bookshelves. At Christmas time, we always gave each other a book. In fact, I recall Beatrice saying, "Christmas isn't Christmas without a book."
Now, all of the rooms on the first floor had many big, large windows and doors. We could open the doors and the windows on a cool summer day, or a warm summer day like we have here now, and we'd have a nice cool breeze in the evening to cool the house off. But it also allowed the inside of the house to flow into the garden and the surrounding areas.
Now, gardening was a hobby of mine, and I loved yellow roses. I planted hedges of yellow roses all along the eastern perimeter of the property. And I'm happy to say that if you go by there today, you'll still see those yellow roses growing there today.
Well, when the house was completed, it had many modern amenities. It had hot and cold running water, electricity, indoor plumbing, and thermostatically controlled steam heat in each room.
It was wonderful.
It certainly was. Well, I farmed until 1920, and then I became a gentleman's farmer. I hired a tenant farmer to take over the total farm operations and took interest in the community. 3 other gentlemen and I took an interest in the Epsom Cannery Company downtown. We bought it. We liked what we saw. And I became the general manager, and I ran it until 1927. And that's when we soon sold it to Cooner Pickle Company. Now, Boulder County didn't really have a fairground. And so I took the chore on as getting the Boulder County Fair assigned to Longmont as a permanent site. And we got that done. Longmont was the agricultural center of Boulder County, and that's where it belonged. Now, I was also active in the community affairs. I was a director of the Red Cross, member of the Chamber of Commerce, and we were members of the St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. I always say, it's a good thing to work for oneself, but it's a glorious thing to work for the good of others.
I do recall you saying that, dear. That was the motto you lived by. Now, I used to hold lovely Sylvan suppers to raise funds for St. Stephen's Church. Now, I wish you could have been here then. It was beautiful. We would set tables up in the yard under the trees and turn the place into a virtual fairyland. What with the beautiful yellow roses, the English country garden, the trees, the shrubbery and flowers. It was so beautiful. We had a bun bush, an ice cream well, a donut tree. We drank buttermilk straight from the churn. We had singing and dancing till the wee hours of the morning. Oh, those were glorious times, weren't they, Charles?
Oh, they certainly were. And we want to thank you for joining us today. For the fathers in the crowd,
Yes, thank
happy
you
Father's
for coming.
Day.
I did want to tell you, though, that our beautiful Hover home is now owned by the St. Vrain Historical Society and open for teas and tours. And if you come by, you may see us again there because we often appear there. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. And if you come by the cemetery, this is where we reside. Stop by. We'd love to talk to you.
At the request of the St. Vrain Historical Society, I've been asked to spend a little time with you this afternoon to tell you a little bit about myself and my history here in Longmont and the St. Vrain Valley area. My name is George W. Brown, GW for short, but my friends call me Cap on account of my Civil War service with the Army of the Potomac. So feel free to call me the same. I must admit I'm a bit embarrassed to be called a founder, a pioneer. Imagine that. Well, like most folks, I just came out to Colorado one day, liked what I saw, and decided to stay. Although I will admit it proved to be an interesting journey that brought me to this particular place and time. So let me start where most people would, at the beginning. I was born on a cool, clear, crisp morning in 1840, March, in the little village town of Leominster, Massachusetts. I grew up like any other lad, under the roof of my pa, Mark Brown, along with two other brothers, two other sisters, I being the oldest. Now the folks thereabout used to holler out to me saying, "George, you got a bit of that wanderlust." Well, looking over my history, I would say I had to agree. You see, when the rebellion broke out in 1861, I couldn't wait to get into the fight. So before long, I joined the 15th Massachusetts Volunteers, got me a second lieutenant's commission, and along with the rest of the boys was assigned to Company A. Before long, we found ourselves outside a little town called Poolesville, Maryland, pulling picket duty along the Potomac, guarding the Capitol. Well, you know, a funny thing, looking back over that time, I must admit I'm a bit surprised I didn't find eternity long before 1865. You see, it was quite a dust-up we had with the Rebs. I don't think they or we thought that the war would last as long as it did. You see, outside of Poolesville, apparently the higher-ups thought, well, we ought to engage these good folk. So one day they sent us across the Potomac into Northern Virginia to a place called Ball's Bluff. Now, I was a young lieutenant at the time, not well versed in military tactics, but I did know if the enemy held the high ground and you held the low ground, that would not make for a particularly good day. By the time that day was over, we were now the bloodied 15th. Well, they sent us back to bivouac. We were refurbished, resupplied, brought in new recruits. We had heavy casualties, some captured. And after some training, they thought only fit that maybe we should chase these Rebs a little more. So they sent us down to a place called Manassas Junction. You might know it as Second Bull Run. Our sole purpose there, unfortunately, was to cover the retreat of the Union Army. You know, it was a funny thing. I can still remember that North Carolinian regiment out over the plain hollering, "Look at General Jackson standing there like a stone wall." Well, we'd run into a stone wall, back we went across the Potomac. Well, once again, after being refitted, more new raw recruits, we found ourselves crossing the Catoctin Mountains of western Maryland to a little town called Sharpsburg. You might remember it as Antietam, Antietam Creek, to this day known in history as the bloodiest single day of combat on the American continent. I know because I was there. You see, we were assigned along with a Minnesota regiment and a New York regiment to attack at a place called the West Woods. Well, we went into those woods, and it would appear that Hood's Texans took umbrage at our approach. Before long, the woods were filled with cannon smoke, musket fire. We engaged the enemy to within 15 yards. It was a horrific fight. In 27 minutes, we had lost over 300 men in our regiment alone, 100 mortally wounded and dead. Good men they were. But the 15th wasn't done. Before long, in '63, July, we found ourselves at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, once again engaging the rebels. Well, I think we fought them to a draw, although now I read the history books and they say we won that battle. Can't hardly imagine it. I remember walking around the campfire, listening to the boys say, how come we didn't chase Bobby Lee across the Potomac and finish this sordid affair once and for all? Well, it wasn't to be. In the spring of '64, we found ourselves under the command of Ulysses S. Grant in a place called the Wilderness. Being an experienced regimental unit, we were assigned the difficult task of capturing a place called the Bloody Angle. And as in all battles, we gave it our best shot. Needless to say, by the time that engagement was over, men could not touch the ground for want of the bodies spread across the field. 2 weeks later, the remainder of our regiment, which stood at 70 able-bodied men, was captured at a place called the Jerusalem Plank Road at Chancellorsville. I and 9 others being the only survivors of the capture. In July, I guess the government saw fit to decommission our operation. The 15th no longer existed as a fighting unit. Well, after the war, for us, and like many veterans, we weren't sure where our lives would lead us, but I knew it wouldn't be back to Massachusetts. I'd seen too much and lost too many good friends. But I decided to stay in the federal service. I became a Secret Service agent for the federal government, and they assigned me out this way to the Colorado Territory. And as I mentioned, I liked what I saw, so I decided to leave the federal service, and with the greenbacks I had earned and saved during the war, bought me a little spread up the North St. Vrain River. A beautiful spread it was indeed. A stand of trees as far as the eye could see, open meadow. So I bought myself some cattle and made myself a rancher. It's been a good life, that I can tell you for sure. But I missed my family, and I'd write home a lot. I'd write home to my siblings and my friends, but mostly to Clara E. Buff, my future bride. You see, Clara would write back to me and say, when are we going to get hitched? And I would write back and say, I still have the wanderlust, and I can't bring a good woman out west without a stake, so I did anything I could do to make money. I even signed the contract in '72 with the railroad to cut stands of timber off my land, float them down the river to the little town of Burlington just south of here, to be milled into railroad ties. I'll tell you, those were good days, ranching and logging. Boy, was I full of piss and vinegar in those days. But things changed around here mighty fast. In 1870, some enterprising fellows from the Chicago Colorado Company bought themselves a square patch of land just south of here and invited some folks from back east. They said that the land was bountiful, that the air was clear and clean. Well, I could attest to that. But I don't suspect those fellas told those folks about the grasshoppers, the heat, the hail, the Indians, or the general lack of water. But I guess in these here United States, anybody's entitled to give it a go. I sure know I did. Well, it was an amazing accomplishment. I don't know how they did it. These pioneers from back east had the same gumption I must have had, and with a little luck and hard work, before long we had all manner of stores along Main Street. Built ourselves a couple of flour mills, and if anybody cared to look, we had more ranches and farms out in the valley than the eye could perceive. It looked like Longmont was going to make a real go of it. Well, I was always a civic-minded person, and people would look to me occasionally, and I can't really remember, well, no, I can remember when I got involved in civic affairs. How could I forget? It was 1879 when the town near burned plumb to the ground. Oh, that was a horrific day. Every business and residence between 3rd and 4th east of Maine burned to the ground. Awful, awful. But with that frontier spirit, us civic leaders got together and said, well, you know, maybe we ought to start ourselves a volunteer fire department. Well, I helped do that. Helped with the first waterworks in town, too. You might say by that time, as much as I love my ranch up in the valley, I became a bit of a townie. Seemed the folks here saw fit to make me a water superintendent and street commissioner for a bit. But I have to tell you, the job I liked most, to be honest with you, was as president of the Firemen's Club. Guess I missed the action. Well, I'll tell you, it's been a good 70 to 80 years for me now. 1881, me and Clara finally got hitched. No spring chickens were we, over 40. It's hard to imagine. I used to write her those letters and she said she'd wait for me. I guess she wasn't kidding, was she? Wonderful woman Clara was. I'll tell you, as much as a pioneer and a founder as any person that set foot in this area. I remember buying cattle up in Wyoming, and she'd send me letters along the way and tell me how much she missed me and loved me and wished I were home, and always fill me in on the latest gossip in town. She was a real civic-minded woman, president of the Grand Army of the Republic, Women's Auxiliary. I was a member of that too, the Grand Army of the Republic, indeed. Yes, indeed. She had more friends than fleas on a dog, I could tell you that. Had a good business head too. When I came down from the ranch and started my brick and tile business here, she helped me get it started. Couldn't have done it without her. She's been gone near 10 years now. Died of the indigestion. Well, but I did find me another good woman, Carrie Sawyer. She takes care of me in my old age, and I do the best I can for her. Indeed, it's been a wonderful life here in Longmont. Well, after you folks mosey on up the lane, I suspect I'll stroll on down to the lodge and meet some of my old friends, and as old men are wont to do, talk about the glory days of muskets and cannon, and kind of just reminisce about the friends we left behind. Well, thanks for stopping by. Captain Brown at your service.
I'm Jarvis Fox. I was born in 1835. This is my lovely wife, Lyda. My brother Marshall and I owned a mill in Brownsville, Illinois. That's when I met Lyda. And when I met Lyda, I knew the days of me being a bachelor were coming to an end.
I was born Lyda Cole in New York in 1844. I moved with my family as a young child to Chicago, Illinois, where I went on to go to college at Wheaton College and become a teacher, which was my lifelong dream. I moved to Brush Hill, Chicago, and was a school teacher there when I met the love of my life, Jarvis Fox. We were married in 1864 and settled in and started our family. We had a son we named George and a daughter named Mabel. We were comfortable. Jarvis was working at the mill with his brother Marshall. When we started to hear from our friends of the Colorado-Chicago colony who came out in 1871, the first colony sent back word that there was a prosperous West to be had by all. Jarvis kept coming home and saying, "We need to start our own flour mill." I didn't want to move the children. I didn't want to move from our family. I kept saying no. It wasn't until the death of our son George from tuberculosis that I went into the pits of despair. Jarvis came home one day and said, "We're moving." So we came out with the second Chicago, Colorado colony in 1872.
And the first colony welcomed us at Longmont with open arms. They needed a mill. They knew I was the man that could put it together for them. The colony donated to us 32 lots on the corner of Main and 3rd. We put up a mill there. We needed power, so we dug ditches from the St. Vrain River for the water power. At the height of production, we could process 400 bushels of grain every 24 hours.
Jarvis called to me and said, "Come, I've got the first wheat for you to bake with," and I went and got the wheat, went back to my kitchen and started baking loaves of bread. Why, I made the headlines of the newspapers, and all of the local wives came to test that bread that was coming out of my oven. We called it the Pride of the Rockies.
When we no longer had to take our grain to Boulder to be milled, we had our own mill in town here.
We went on to have 2 more daughters. However, a settler's wife, the life of a pioneer was very, very difficult. Our next daughter, Julia, died at the age of 4 from swallowing lye. Our next daughter, Ethel, went on to be married at a young age, but didn't live to see 30. It was a hard life, the pioneer life. And James?
James Danino, my foreman, who also moved out to Colorado with us from Illinois, him and his wife, Harriet, lost a daughter from a drowning in one of the ditches. James went on to open his own mill, which he called the Longmont Flour Mill. And I'm proud to say flour power put Longmont on the map.
We had 4 children, and our only surviving daughter, Mabel, did go on to marry Frank Downer. He was the president of the sugar company in Denver, and he actually brought sugar to Longmont also. He went on to be elected the superintendent of the Denver Mint, and they moved to Denver. We didn't always live in Longmont. Maybe we should share with the people. We moved.
Yep. We moved to Chugwater, Wyoming.
Wyoming.
I wanted to take my hand at ranching, and we tried that for 7 years, but it just didn't seem like home. In 1897, we packed up, sold the ranch, and moved back to Longmont.
To be with our friends.
But little did I know then, is I only was going to have Lyda to be with me for 7 more years. In 1904, she died at the age of 59.
Jarvis then moved to Denver to be with Mabel in his final years. He died in 1922, 87 years young. Thank you.
My pap, he's talking to his father, Father Charles Dickens, and Charles suggested he maybe go out west and see what this new country's all about. And so pap, he bought fare on a boat out of England. That boat ended up being called the Johnny Walker, I hear tell.
Well, he loaded up his wife, my older sister, and on that cruise coming over, Ma'am told me that it was a dark and stormy night when I was born. I imagine that's what helped make me the rough and tumbled guy I was to survive the out west group later in life. We landed in New York and worked our way up to Quebec, Canada. It was a rough time up there, and winters were long and cold, and Pap was a little bit older fella. And we worked our way down to Wisconsin. Here, tell, that's where you're from.
Yeah, I was born in Sharon, Wisconsin. Well,
Yeah, times were tough in Wisconsin. They had a drought going on, and Pap just couldn't make a go of it. He just kept working, though, and worked himself to death. I was 4 years old when he died. And ended up losing my older sister, too, and my younger sister that was born after we got here died also. I guess Ma'am waited the appropriate amount of time before she got remarried and married a fellow called Alonzo Allen. He was a good man. He's a hard worker, and he tried to make do with the family there in Wisconsin, but man, times were tough. We hit another drought and just couldn't make it through, it seemed like, and he thought maybe best bet is leave the family there, and he'd come out with the 59ers to do some gold panning and gold digging out at Pikes Peak. He said he'd send for us later. Well, he headed on out, and I kind of felt like I needed to take care of the family best I could. But time passed, and I ended up being about 16 years old, and I figured it was time to go find Alonzo and see what was up, get on out here and see when he was going to call for the rest of the family. So I grabbed a ticket on the train and took it as far as the train went at the time. I was up there at North Platte. Ended up getting to know some people there and some other guys about my own age, and we figured if we put our money together and got about 3 horses each, and the horse we were riding, we could come on out here to Denver and sell them and have our startup money and actually get something rolling. So we did that, and it was a pretty good plan. No one messed with us, nobody robbed us, nobody tried to hustle our horses or nothing, because there was enough of us, they didn't want to hassle with us. So we did that. Got on out here to Denver, and sure enough, we sold them horses for a profit and got some startup money. I got word up to my stepfather, and he got word back, and I read that note, and it said, if you want to find my camp, go north out of Denver to the 5th River crossing, follow it west. So that's what I did, and I followed that river west till I found them. That worked out pretty good. We did teamstry work and hauled logs and did some wagon hauling for the early pioneers, and came on down here into this fertile valley alongside the St. Vrain River, where what's called Boulder Creek now comes into it, and built the first cabin in the area. We were pretty good at building things, it seemed like, the two of us. So we started finding out about this Wells Fargo stage line, wanting to put a line through from Denver to Cheyenne, Denver to Laramie, so we started building barns for the stage stops. Made some money that way, bought that first parcel of property back there in, what, 1862?
that's right. Well, you purchased the property. It was one of the original first land grants, deeded to a war widow of 1812, conveyed to William H., all in the same document, signed by the then President Andrew Johnson of his day, and it is the oldest known land grant in the state of Colorado.
Yeah, and we figured we'd try to do our hand at crops there and stuff. It was fertile enough ground, but we just weren't getting enough moisture. So me and Beckwith decided, why don't we start digging some ditches and running some ditch water? And we did. He signed his name down first, got ditch right number 1, I got ditch right number 2, and we got a few more ditch rights. End up that water, there's still a ditch right down that property, one of the original ones. And then I bought some more land with some money we were making, and ended up about 1864, ended up getting mustered into militia. The different guys about my age in the area figured that it was time to do some fighting, I guess. The Indians were uprising and whatnot. And here's the Company D, 3rd Colorado Cavalry. And we ended up on a march out east and ended up at the Big Sandy, Chief Black Kettle's encampment. And it was a cold, blistery morning. You could see your breath in those campfires, and we started firing, and sure enough, they called it right. It was a massacre. I don't much like talking about that battle. It just wasn't right. Ended up getting my hat shot off at it, though. I come that close to dying. It just got my hat right off my head.
Well, and then here told that one of the commanders of the other cavalry from Weld County, Morris Coffin, told me about that with Will. And Will, you got to tell him that ain't the first time and it wasn't the last time.
Oh, the Du Bois feud, they called it. There's a couple of Du Bois brothers. They were a rascally couple of guys. They ended up robbing some stage lines, and one of them, they shot the stage driver dead. Well, being the constable of Burlington Village, me and another fella, also was constable of this whole, what they called Boulder County, and I put a posse together, and we went out after that Du Bois. And heard tell he was held up at his cousin's farm, and somehow he got word I was coming out after him, and I come over that bluff, and he had grabbed his rifle from his cousin, and he fired off a shot my hat off for the second time. Thank goodness that sight was, the cousin had been shooting prairie dogs, or no, he was shooting jackrabbits or something, I guess, and had sighted in for 300 yards. Well, thank goodness I was only at 100 yards, otherwise that bullet had found my chest.
Well, I'm glad he didn't, because then you went ahead and built yourself a pretty nice home about 1872. And
it's about time you came out, isn't it?
Yeah, I came out with my father, and we kind of joined up with the Chicago Colony, and he was one of the founders of the First National Bank, Longmont.
Yeah, I started up the Farmers Bank and married you in 1876. Fine, good-looking gal. I saw her. She was up on a porch. I was heading for one of the Founders Day picnics or something like that up at the new Roosevelt Park the Chicago Colony had set up. And she was up there slamming a hammer into a nail, holding up that bunting flag stuff on the porch. And that sun was shining behind her, and she was wearing that prairie dress. And she just caught my eye, and I had to marry her.
Yeah, we had 5 children. We had William Arnett, after you. We had John, but we called him Jack. Then we had Renzi Charles, and we named his middle name after your paternal grandfather, Charles Dickens.
Yep.
And we had 2 daughters, Mary, and we had then our Lisa. And our Lisa joined us here a little bit, and she's next to us over here on this side. But Will and I were doing very well. And, well, town kind of had a mishap in 1879 with the fire. Our store was about the only one left.
That was good fortune for us, because we sold out all our goods and bought some more and sold them out too. Yeah. Bought some more land.
Decided that, we needed a little bit of culture, so we built the Dickens Opera House in 1881. And then somewhere along the line, I guess, what was it, about 1898, Will? They said Will was the single largest paying taxpayer in Boulder County with all his land holdings. He helped with the farmer's mill and
sugar mill. We dug ditches to the flour mills so they could run their mills to mill the flour out. Had fingers and money invested in those too.
Yeah, built a 17-room mansion to retire up here off of 3rd and Kaufman, because we figured, well, we wanted to have, our kids stay and grandchildren. We had plenty enough of those to come visit us, and Will could kind of, check in on the family and the farms a little here and there, and just kind of retire a little bit. He worked pretty hard and long, and we thought, well, that was kind of the, the place to be in town.
Set all the kids up with their own farms and the girls with their own houses. And
hard to leave it next door.
Yeah, she built a fine place next door.
Yes, she did.
That worked out well. Well, I was sitting there that night, relaxing after a hard day's work with Ida sitting next to me, and all of a sudden I hear this bang and a crack through the glass and a sting in my neck, and that bullet came out the other side, grazed Ida's cheek, and embedded itself in the wall.
That was the darkest night of my life. About 8 o'clock, November 30th, 1915. Almost to the day of Sand Creek.
40 years later after Sand Creek.
Well, Arda and her husband heard the shot and came a-coming. I called Dr. John Andrew, our family doctor. Couldn't get through. The operator said there was something long-distance call. Said, I need him. She broke through, and I told John, you got to come. Something's happened to Will. Well, the next day in the newspaper, they reported that he was mortally wounded. I'd lost my husband.
Never had a chance to read that paper.
No. Well, the darkest days weren't yet to come. Bank decided to put up a $1,000 reward for any information with the information for anything for catching the murder of my husband. 2 days later, my son Renzi was charged with the murder of my husband, William H. Dickens. They wanted to call it black patricide. Yeah, a few days later, it was reported that Will had done well for me, and he'd left me a estate over $1 million. I said, I'll do whatever it takes to get my son out of jail. Well, they started the trial in 1916 over in Boulder. All my kin were there, all my boys, all my grandkids, everybody was there. Well, they convicted my son Renzi of second-degree murder, 1916. Asked for a writ of supersedeas with the state Supreme Court so that we could get really a fair trial. Decided that, you know, Will had done a great job around the community, so I had him go ahead and put this monolith in over here behind. 10-ton base down over here. Nice perch-around horses brought it in, Will.
We raised some good perch-arounds.
Yeah, put an 8-ton on top. It's actually hollow inside, but that's 8-ton on top. Decided the town needed to know what good job Will had done. Well, son John went and stayed at his farm up North Park, and William stayed down here at the farm, which is now on Main Street, which I understand the people who got it now still continuing to have people there like we did with the stagecoach when they had too many people, and have
Sure
a bed and
enough.
breakfast. And they put a barn on there that the other one burned down in '45 and replaced it. Renzi had to sell the farm up here. Ardalisa still had the house next door. We decided that Renzi should probably head to Santa Barbara, helped him out there with an apartment. And so I wasn't sure if I really wanted to stay in the mansion really kind of all that much longer. And so I decided I'd stand it between all my kids and spend some winters out in Santa Barbara and enjoy the weather and some of my old age. Well, here be told, I guess, 10th of June, 1933, the night I died, Santa Barbara, there was one of the worst earthquakes in Santa Barbara history and basically flattened the whole town. And that, my folks, is a tale of woe.
Yeah, that night I was shot, I wish I'd have been wearing my hat.
Good day to all. My name is John Brigham Thompson, and this here is my second wife, Maud Wirt.
Hello.
I hail from Maine, born there in 1837, and then moved to Wisconsin in '56, where I met my first wife, Kitty Hubbard. Lovely, lovely woman. Then 10 years later, we moved down here to Colorado on the train with her brother's family. And they actually built a twin house with us down on Terry Street. My Kitty and I had a son together, John Royal, and he had 2 sons. One of them unfortunately died along with him of typhoid fever, but fortunately his wife was able to survive so that she could take care of their youngest, John Frederick.
There were certainly a lot of Johns in the family. It really makes it pretty confusing.
It sure does. I guess we weren't very creative back then. So many Johns. It could have been Ernest or Albert or something. Anyway, I digress. Kitty's brother actually was a postmaster here in Longmont, wasn't he?
He was. You know, when Chicago people came out to start Longmont, they brought everything they needed. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and even the postmaster.
I guess so. But after 27 years of wonderful marriage with Kitty, she passed away, but fortunately I met this lovely lady, Maud Wirt, who I made my wife. And our youngest, our only grandson, he calls you Mumsy, doesn't he?
He does. It's a very dear name to me. I prefer Mumsy over Maud.
Yes. Well, we still find time to, you know, walk around and stroll the beauty of Longmont and reminisce about the wonderful times when we used to live at 537 Terry Street.
It was a wonderful, stately old house. It's called the Watermelon House. It's kind of a reddish, pinkish color and was used as a street marker before they had street signs. They would just say, turn at the watermelon colored house. It's still that color today. It's a very fun old house with Gothic roof lines. It has black Italian marble fireplaces that were imported. There is lots of stained glass throughout the house. The flooring is made with 3 different designs of parquet flooring that is just like artwork on the floor. It's really quite fun, and it's still walked on today and in really good shape.
And of course, while that grand structure was being built, Kitty and I moved our little bungalow down the road. But also, because I had my hardware store in the town, I was able to showcase some of my wares, like beautiful doorknobs or keyholes or locks for the house.
They were really jewelry for the house, and they are still in good shape today as well. In the current issue of Romantic Home magazine, they're featuring our doorknob right now. So you can get this on the newsstand, so it's kind of fun to see. It's 118 years old.
But my favorite room in the house is the library. And actually nowadays, don't the current owners use it as a tea room?
It works well for that too. But the library was very dignified. It had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves with lots of first editions of books, lots of signatures in the books as well. And a lot of those have been donated to the Longmont Museum.
Certainly did. Of course, I was a writer myself, so that's why I loved the library so much. And my favorite author was Mark Twain, who I tried to use his wit and humor in the Longmont Ledger, the paper at the time, when I wrote a couple columns for it. But I'm not sure that the townspeople quite understood Twain's or my humor.
You were such a witty, clever man. He was actually nicknamed Foxy because he was always doing something a little on the edge of being a prankster. I particularly remember one night when the troops came back from World War I. He was so excited, he went out in the street and woke all the neighbors, clanging a cowbell, and just thought everyone should be up at 2 a.m. celebrating the fact that the troops were coming home.
I did, didn't I? Well, I knew, of course, because I myself was a troop coming home at one point when I fought in the Civil War with the Iron Brigade, my brigade, and we fought in the first Battle of Bull Run with such powerful and influential man as Sherman.
You knew him, actually. You knew a lot of important people. You were actually the delegate to the Republican Convention, which elected Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley.
In fact, I went to old Teddy's home to tell him that his party had chosen him for vice presidency.
You did know a lot of important people, but you were an important man yourself. He was mayor of the town, town treasurer, town clerk, GAR, Sons of the Revolution, deacon of the church, trustee of the bank, member of the school board. It just goes on and on. He was very much a civic leader.
Or you could call me a busybody.
They always used to joke at the bank that he said he was the official fly swatter when he was actually the president of the bank.
Well, I didn't want to brag.
You were always being silly and fun, and that always made life a real treat to live with you. Such a good time. But we spent a lot of our time strolling along, looking at all the old trees that were planted by the original men who came out from Chicago. They just grew so quickly. It was always so fun to stroll.
We did love a good stroll, although we never did like those newfangled cars. Wasn't so much big with us, but we did like the trains, and we would go down the train down to Erie, and then once it was developed into Denver, and even the housewives could sell their wares and send them to Denver.
Extra eggs, extra butter, you just loaded it right on the train and they took it to Denver for you.
Absolutely. And then our grandson would go between his grandparents in Boulder to his grandparents in Longmont, and took him 30 minutes in, and I hear it still takes 30 minutes today.
It was so fun to see his smiling face as he came up the hill walking to our house. Great fun. Besides walking and riding the train, we also used horses a lot. And there were hitching posts right in the front of the old house where you could come and tie up your horse and come in for a visit. Those old stones are still there today, so I'd like to invite all of you to come ride your horse on over to 530 Cemetary. It is now a bed and breakfast as well as a tea room. You could come right on in after you've gotten off your horse and come in and have a cup of tea. We'd love to have you.
Absolutely. Shall we continue our stroll?